Welcome. I trust you are ready for a new mystery to unfold.
The Glove in the Greenhouse. A Hercule Poirot mystery. Welcome to Cozy Mysteries. I'm Stephen, and today I invite you to join me as we step into the perfectly polished shoes of the legendary Belgian detective, Hercule Poirot. Together we shall witness how his remarkable little grey cells unravel a most perplexing case of murder among the orchids. Chapter 1. The Flower of Death. The morning mist still clung to the glass panes of Ashford Manor's greenhouse when Mrs. Pemberton discovered the body. Her piercing scream shattered the peaceful silence of the estate gardens, sending the ravens from their roost in the ancient oak that overlooked the conservatory. Professor Theodore Ashford lay sprawled among his prized orchids, his face bearing the unmistakable purple marks of strangulation. The renowned botanist's fingers were still twisted around a single brown leather glove, its mate nowhere to be seen. The irony was not lost on those who knew him. A man who had dedicated his life to nurturing delicate blooms had met his end surrounded by the very flowers he cherished. The local constabulary arrived with their usual efficiency, led by Inspector Meadows, a solid man who possessed more determination than imagination. After surveying the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had witnessed too many such horrors, he made his decision. "This is beyond the usual run of things," he confided to his sergeant. "I've heard tell of a Belgian gentleman who's made quite a name for himself in London. They say he can solve cases that would baffle Scotland Yard itself." And so it was that on a grey October morning, the distinctive figure of Hercule Poirot alighted from the 10:47 train at Little Ashford Station. His appearance was, as always, immaculate, from his precisely waxed moustache to his patent leather shoes that gleamed despite the threatening rain. The detective's green eyes surveyed the countryside with interest, though one might have detected a slight wrinkle of his nose at the rural simplicity of it all. Inspector Meadows met him at the station, clearly relieved to transfer the burden of the investigation to more capable hands. As they drove through the village in the inspector's modest motor car, Poirot observed the quiet streets with the attention he typically reserved for the most complex of puzzles. "Tell me, Inspector," Poirot said, adjusting his position to avoid a particularly violent jolt in the road, "what manner of man was this Professor Ashford?" "Well respected, Mr. Poirot. Been living at the manor for nigh on 20 years, ever since he inherited it from his uncle. Made quite a name for himself in botanical circles, they say. Specialized in orchids, had varieties from all over the world in that greenhouse of his. And his relationships with others. One assumes a man of his standing would have many acquaintances." Inspector Meadows shifted uncomfortably. "That's where it gets complicated, sir. The professor wasn't what you'd call a sociable man. Kept to himself mostly, except for his work. But lately," he paused, navigating around a particularly deep pothole. "Yes. Well, there'd been some tensions in the household. The professor had been acting strangely these past few weeks. Mrs. Pemberton, she's the housekeeper, said he'd been receiving letters that seemed to upset him greatly, and there were visitors he normally wouldn't entertain." As they approached Ashford Manor, Poirot's sharp eyes took in every detail of the imposing Georgian structure. The house sat proudly amid perfectly manicured gardens, though even from the drive one could see the large glass greenhouse that dominated the eastern wing. It was there, among the exotic blooms and humid air, that death had paid its visit. The household had gathered in the drawing-room, awaiting the famous detective's arrival. Mrs. Pemberton, a stern-faced woman in her 50s, sat rigidly in a chair by the window. Beside her stood Dr. Marcus Whitley, the family physician who had pronounced the professor dead. Near the fireplace, a younger man paced nervously, James Ashford, the professor's nephew and heir. In the corner, almost forgotten, sat Miss Ellen Hartwell, the professor's research assistant, her pale hands folded in her lap. But it was the fifth person present who drew Poirot's immediate attention. Colonel Reginald Thornfield stood apart from the others, his military bearing evident despite his civilian clothes. There was something in his manner that suggested a man accustomed to command, yet his eyes held a wariness that spoke of secrets closely guarded. "Ladies and gentlemen," Inspector Meadows announced, "this is Monsieur Hercule Poirot, who has kindly agreed to assist us in this matter." Poirot bowed slightly, his manner courteous but observant. "I am honored to be of service. Before I examine the scene of the crime, perhaps you would be so good as to tell me your movements yesterday evening." The responses came in a carefully rehearsed chorus. Mrs. Pemberton had been in the village, shopping for household supplies until well past 8 o'clock. Dr. Whitley had been attending to a difficult birth on the other side of the county, and had not returned until nearly midnight. James Ashford claimed to have been at the pub in the village, drinking with several companions until closing time. Miss Hartwell had gone to visit her sister in the neighbouring town of Millbrook, returning only this morning. Each alibi seemed solid, each witness accounted for, yet Poirot noticed how their eyes avoided his penetrating gaze, how their voices carried just the slightest tremor of uncertainty. Experience had taught him that in cases of murder, the most carefully constructed alibis often concealed the darkest truths. "And you, Colonel Thornfield?" Poirot asked, turning his attention to the military man. The colonel straightened to his full height. "I was here at the manor. The professor had invited me for dinner to discuss a business matter. We concluded our conversation around 7:30, and I retired to the guest room. I heard nothing unusual during the night." Here then was the one person without an alibi, yet according to Inspector Meadows' preliminary investigation, Colonel Thornfield appeared to have no motive for murder. He was by all accounts merely a casual acquaintance of the professor, connected only through their shared service in India decades earlier. As Poirot processed this information, his hand unconsciously stroked his moustache, a habit his companions had learned to recognize as a sign of deep concentration. The pieces of the puzzle were before him, but like seeds scattered on barren ground, they had yet to take root in his remarkable mind. "If you would be so kind," Poirot said finally, "I should like to examine the greenhouse now." Chapter 2. Among the Orchids. The greenhouse stood like a crystal palace against the grey sky, its glass panels catching what little light penetrated the October clouds. As Poirot approached the structure, he paused to observe the building itself, noting the modern heating system, the carefully arranged ventilation, and the meticulous organization that spoke of a man devoted to his craft. Inspector Meadows produced the key with some ceremony. "We've kept it locked since this morning, Mr. Poirot. Nothing's been disturbed except for removing the body, of course." The interior of the greenhouse enveloped them in humid warmth, a stark contrast to the crisp autumn air outside. Rows upon rows of orchids created a tropical paradise in the heart of the English countryside. Cattleyas hung in magnificent purple and white splendor, while delicate dendrobiums cascaded from their perches like frozen waterfalls. The air was thick with the scent of earth, moisture, and the subtle perfumes of exotic blooms. Poirot moved through the space with the care of a man navigating a cathedral. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, missed nothing, not the overturned stool near the propagation bench, not the scattered soil that formed a rough circle around the spot where the body had been found, not the single brown leather glove that still lay where Professor Ashford's lifeless fingers had released it. The professor was found here. Poirot indicated the area near a magnificent specimen of Paphiopedilum sanderianum, its long twisted petals giving it an almost sinister appearance in the subdued light. "Yes, sir. Mrs. Pemberton discovered him at approximately 7 this morning, when she brought his usual cup of tea. She's been doing that every morning for the past 15 years, she says." Poirot knelt beside the chalk outline that marked where the body had lain. The position suggested that Professor Ashford had been facing his attacker, had perhaps even welcomed them into his sanctuary. There were no signs of a struggle among the delicate plants, no broken pots or trampled flowers to indicate violence. "Most curious," Poirot murmured, his fingers hovering just above the soil without quite touching it. "The professor, he dies among his orchids, yet the orchids themselves remain unharmed. This suggests someone who knew the greenhouse well, who could move through it without causing damage." He stood and walked slowly along the central aisle, his head tilted as if listening to some inner voice. Near the rear of the greenhouse, where the rarest specimens were kept, his attention was caught by something unusual. "Inspector, regardez. This watering can, you see how it sits." The copper watering can, obviously expensive and well maintained, sat at an odd angle on the potting bench. Its spout pointed not toward the plants, as one would expect, but toward the door, as if someone had set it down hastily while facing the entrance. could be nothing, Mr. Poirot. Perhaps the professor just set it down carelessly, perhaps. But Professor Ashford, from what I observe of his work, was not a careless man. Every pot, every tool, every plant has its place. This, he gestured to the watering can, is not in its place. Poirot continued his examination, noting the specialized tools hanging in precise order on the walls, the carefully labeled seed packets arranged in alphabetical order, the meticulous records book that lay open on the desk. It was the work of a man who approached his passion with scientific rigor. But it was near the heating system that Poirot made his most intriguing discovery. Partially hidden behind a large Cattleya dowiana, he found traces of soil that seemed different from the standard potting mixture used throughout the greenhouse. This soil was darker, richer, and had an unusual texture that suggested a different composition entirely. Inspector, has this soil been analyzed? Well, no, sir, we didn't think. I mean, soil is soil, isn't it? Ah, mon ami, how wrong you are. To a botanist, soil is like a fingerprint. Each mixture tells a story, and this soil, it does not belong with these orchids. Poirot carefully collected a sample in one of the professor's specimen envelopes, then turned his attention to the plants themselves. His knowledge of botany was limited, but his knowledge of human nature was encyclopedic. Somewhere among these exotic blooms lay the key to understanding why Professor Theodore Ashford had died. It was then that he noticed something that made him pause. Among a collection of Phalaenopsis orchids, commonly known as moth orchids, sat one specimen that seemed oddly out of place. While its neighbors displayed the characteristic flat, broad petals of their species, this particular plant bore flowers with an entirely different structure. Inspector, would you be so kind as to summon Miss Hartwell? I believe her expertise may be required. When the research assistant arrived, her eyes were red-rimmed and her hands trembled slightly. She moved through the greenhouse with the familiarity of someone who had spent countless hours among these plants, yet Poirot noticed how she avoided looking directly at the spot where her employer had died. Miss Hartwell, if you would be so kind, this orchid here, it seems different from its companions. Could you identify it for me? Ellen Hartwell approached the plant with professional interest, her grief momentarily set aside by the call of scientific curiosity. She examined the flower carefully, her brow furrowing in concentration. This is most unusual, Monsieur Poirot. This appears to be a Cypripedium calceolus, a lady's slipper orchid. But it shouldn't be here among the Phalaenopsis. They have completely different growing requirements. The professor would never have made such an error. And yet here it is. Tell me, when did you last work in this section of the greenhouse? 3 days ago. I'm certain this plant wasn't here then. I would have noticed immediately. It's completely wrong for this environment. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. And in your opinion, how long could such a plant survive in these conditions? Not long, perhaps a week at most, before it would begin to show signs of stress. The humidity levels here are all wrong for a lady's slipper. As they made their way back toward the entrance, Poirot's sharp eyes caught one final detail that the local constabulary had missed. Near the door, partially concealed by the broad leaves of a Brassia orchid, were faint traces of mud on the wooden walkway. The mud was darker than the soil used in the greenhouse, and it had dried in a pattern that suggested it had been tracked in from outside. The killer, Poirot said quietly to Inspector Meadows, came here with soil on their shoes, soil that tells us where they had been before they committed murder. Chapter 3. Secrets in the Soil. The morning sun had begun to burn away the mist, as Poirot and Inspector Meadows made their way back to the manor house. The detective's mind was already working through the peculiarities he had observed in the greenhouse, cataloguing each anomaly like a botanist classifying specimens. Inspector, Poirot said as they paused on the terrace, I should like to speak with each member of the household individually, and I believe a more thorough examination of Professor Ashford's personal effects would prove illuminating. The professor's study proved to be as meticulously organized as his greenhouse. Books on botany lined the walls, their spines bearing the names of the great naturalists, Darwin, Hooker, Lindley. The desk was dominated by a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with careful observations written in the professor's precise handwriting. Poirot settled into the leather chair behind the desk and began to read. The journal entries from recent weeks painted a picture of a man increasingly troubled by something beyond his scientific work. References to unwelcome visitors and disturbing revelations appeared with growing frequency. The entry from 3 days before the murder was particularly intriguing. The past has a way of blooming in the most unexpected seasons. What I thought buried has taken root again. The decision I made 20 years ago may have been the wrong one, but how does one rectify the errors of youth? The letter from India has changed everything. Honor demands action, but at what cost? India. Poirot made a mental note of this reference. Colonel Thornfield had served in India, as had Professor Ashford himself, many years ago. Perhaps this connection was more significant than it initially appeared. A soft knock interrupted his reading. Mrs. Pemberton entered, carrying a tea service with the efficiency of long practice. Inspector Meadows said you'd be wanting some refreshment, sir. Most thoughtful. Please, Mrs. Pemberton, sit down. I should like to ask you a few questions about your employer. The housekeeper perched on the edge of a chair, her back straight and her manner formal. I'll help however I can, sir, though I can't imagine what I could tell you that would be of use. You discovered the body this morning. That must have been most distressing. Indeed it was, sir. In all my 15 years at the manor, I've never had such a shock. The professor was such a gentleman, I can't imagine who would want to harm him. Yet you mentioned to Inspector Meadows that he had been receiving disturbing letters recently. Mrs. Pemberton's hands tightened in her lap. It's not my place to read the master's correspondence, sir, but I could see they upset him. He would go quite pale after reading them, and he took to locking himself in his study for hours at a time. And the visitors? Were there many people the professor did not usually entertain? Colonel Thornfield was the most recent, sir. But there were others, a gentleman from London who came twice in the past month, and a lady who claimed to be researching orchids for a book she was writing. Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. A lady researcher. This is the first I have heard of such a person. She only came once, sir, about 10 days ago. Quite insistent she was, saying she had travelled a great distance specifically to see the professor's collection. He wasn't best pleased about the interruption, but his manners wouldn't allow him to turn her away. Can you describe this lady? Middle-aged, sir, well-dressed but not fashionable, if you take my meaning. Spoke with a slight accent, foreign, but I couldn't place it. She wore gloves, I remember fine leather ones that she never removed, even when the professor offered her tea, brown leather gloves. Poirot filed this detail away carefully. And did she give her name? Mrs. Marchmont, she said, but Mrs. Pemberton hesitated. Yes, well, sir, when she left I found a handkerchief in the drawing room. It had initials embroidered on it. E.B. not men as you'd expect. I thought it odd at the time. When Mrs. Pemberton had departed, Poirot turned his attention to the professor's desk drawers. Most contained the expected scientific paraphernalia, seed catalogues, correspondence with other botanists, detailed cultivation notes, but the bottom drawer was locked. The lock yielded easily to Poirot's ministrations, a skill acquired during his days as a young policeman in Belgium. Inside he discovered a collection of items that painted a very different picture of Professor Ashford's recent state of mind. There were indeed letters from India, postmarked from Calcutta, and written in a feminine hand. The most recent was dated just 2 weeks before the murder. Theodore. I can no longer remain silent about what happened at Darjeeling. The truth must come out, whatever the consequences. I am coming to England, and I expect you to do the right thing at last. The children deserve to know the truth about their father. E.B. Beneath the letters, Poirot found a photograph that made him pause. It showed a group of young people in colonial dress, posed before what appeared to be a tea plantation. The back of the photograph was annotated in the professor's handwriting, Darjeeling, 1903, T.A., R.T., E.B., M.C. Theodore Ashford and Reginald Thornfield were easily recognizable as younger versions of the men Poirot had met. But who were E.B. and M.C., and what secret from those distant days in India had returned to haunt the present? The final item in the drawer was perhaps the most significant, a marriage certificate dated 1904, bearing the names Theodore Ashford and Elizabeth Barati. The certificate had been torn nearly in half, then carefully mended with paste. As Poirot studied these revelations, the pieces of the puzzle began to form a pattern. The mysterious Mrs. Marchmont, with her brown leather gloves, and her initials EB, the references to India and children, the marriage certificate, all pointed to a secret that had lain dormant for 20 years before blooming into murder. A sound from the garden caught his attention. Through the study window, he could see Miss Hartwell walking quickly toward the village, a large bag clutched in her hands. Her usually composed demeanor had given way to obvious agitation, and she glanced repeatedly over her shoulder as if expecting pursuit. Poirot made a mental note to investigate Miss Hartwell's sudden departure more thoroughly. In his experience, when someone fled immediately after a detective began asking questions, they usually had excellent reasons for their haste. But first he needed to learn more about the soil sample he had collected from the greenhouse. The unusual composition suggested it had come from a specific location, and that location might well lead him to his murderer. Chapter 4. The Colonel's Confession. The Rose and Crown Inn stood at the heart of Little Ashford village, its Tudor beams and mullioned windows speaking of centuries spent serving travellers and locals alike. Poirot found Inspector Meadows in the public bar, nursing a pint, and looking thoroughly overwhelmed by the complexity of the case. "Any luck with that soil sample, Mr. Poirot?" "Indeed, Inspector. Most illuminating. I have had it examined by a gentleman at the Agricultural College. The composition indicates soil from a churchyard, specifically, soil that has been enriched by, shall we say, organic matter over many decades." Inspector Meadows nearly choked on his beer. "You mean grave soil, precedent. Someone visited St. Mary's churchyard recently, and traces of that distinctive earth followed them into the greenhouse. I suggest we pay a visit to the vicar, Reverend Blackwood, I believe his name is. The ancient church of St. Mary's perched on a small hill overlooking the village, its Norman tower speaking of faith that had endured through centuries of change. Reverend Blackwood proved to be a thin, scholarly man in his 60s, who received them in his cramped study with obvious curiosity. "A terrible business about Professor Ashford," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "Such a quiet man devoted to his plants. I can't imagine why anyone would want to harm him." Reverend Poirot began carefully. "Have you had any visitors to the churchyard recently? Perhaps someone seeking information about old graves?" The vicar's face brightened. "Why, yes. Just yesterday afternoon, a lady came asking about the Bharati Memorial. Quite unusual, really. It's not a grave that attracts many visitors." "The Bharati Memorial?" "Yes, a rather sad story actually. A young Indian woman who died in 1904, shortly after arriving in England. Consumption, the death certificate said, though there were whispers at the time about other circumstances. She's buried in the far corner of the churchyard, where they used to put, well, those who weren't quite accepted by local society." Poirot exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Meadows. "And this lady visitor, could you describe her?" "Middle-aged, well-dressed, foreign accent. She seemed quite emotional when she found the grave, spent nearly an hour there, just standing in silent contemplation. When she left she took some soil from the gravesite. I thought it odd, but grief makes people do strange things." "Did she give her name, Mrs. Bharati?" "Said she was a distant relative, come to pay her respects at last." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with increasing clarity. As they walked back toward the manor, Poirot shared his growing understanding of the case with Inspector Meadows. The woman calling herself Mrs. Marchmont was in fact Mrs. Bharati, or more precisely, Mrs. Elizabeth Bharati Ashford, the professor's first wife, whom everyone believed to be dead. Her visit to the greenhouse was not about orchids, Inspector. It was about confronting her husband with the truth of their past. But why would she kill him? That remains to be determined, but I suspect we shall find our answer when we locate the second glove. They found Colonel Thornfield in the manor's library, reading a military history by the fire. He looked up as they entered, and Poirot noticed how the man's eyes immediately went to his hands, as if checking something. "Colonel," Poirot said without preamble, "I believe it is time for you to tell us the truth about your relationship with Professor Ashford, and about what really happened in India 20 years ago." The Colonel's military bearing seemed to crumble before their eyes. He set down his book with hands that trembled slightly, and gazed into the fire, as if seeking answers in the flames. "I wondered when this day would come," he said quietly. "I've been carrying the weight of it for 20 years. The truth, Colonel, all of it."
Thornfield drew a deep breath. Theodore and I were stationed together in Darjeeling in 1903, young officers, full of ourselves and convinced we understood the world. Theodore fell in love with a local woman, Elizabeth Barati, daughter of a tea plantation manager, mixed heritage, English father, Indian mother, beautiful, intelligent, completely unsuitable according to the social conventions of the time. They married, secretly, yes. Theodore was besotted with her. But when his commanding officer learned of the marriage, he was given an ultimatum: annul the marriage and accept a transfer back to England, or face court-martial for conduct unbecoming an officer. And Professor Ashford chose his career. The colonel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. We all did, Mr. Poirot. I was Theodore's best friend, and I helped him perpetuate the fiction that Elizabeth had died of consumption. She was given money to disappear, to start a new life somewhere else. Theodore returned to England, inherited his uncle's estate, and tried to forget what he had done. But Elizabeth Barati survived, more than survived. She married again, had children, built a life for herself in Burma. But she never forgot the injustice of what had been done to her. And when she learned that Theodore had become successful and respected while she remained an exile from everything she had known, Inspector Meadows leaned forward. She came back for revenge. She came back for justice. Colonel Thornfield corrected. She wanted Theodore to acknowledge their marriage publicly, to admit what he had done to her. She wanted her children to know the truth about their parentage. And you, Colonel, what was your role in this confrontation? Thornfield's face aged 10 years in as many seconds. Theodore asked me to come here, to help him decide what to do. Elizabeth had written, threatening to expose everything unless he made amends. His reputation, his standing in the scientific community, his nephew's inheritance, everything would have been destroyed by the scandal. So you advised him to? I advised him to do the honorable thing at last, to acknowledge Elizabeth as his wife, to provide for her and her children, to make what amends he could for 20 years of silence. Poirot studied the colonel's face carefully, but someone disagreed with this advice. Colonel Thornfield's composure finally cracked entirely. I found him, Mr. Poirot, this morning before Mrs. Pemberton raised the alarm. I couldn't sleep, went for an early walk in the garden. I saw the greenhouse door standing open, and I found Theodore lying there dead, with Elizabeth's glove clutched in his hand. And you said nothing. I panicked. I thought she had killed him rather than face continued exile. I removed the other glove from the scene and disposed of it, hoping to protect her. But then when everyone else claimed to have alibis, I realized I might be the only one without protection from suspicion. Inspector Meadows stood up abruptly. Colonel Thornfield, I must ask you to accompany me to the station for further questioning. But Poirot held up a hand. "Un moment, Inspector. Colonel, where exactly did you dispose of this second glove?" "I burned it in the library fireplace. The ashes should still be there." "And yet, mon ami," Poirot said gently, "I have examined that fireplace thoroughly. There are no traces of burned leather, no residue from any glove. Perhaps you would care to reconsider your story." Chapter 5. The Assistant's Secret. The revelation that Colonel Thornfield had lied about disposing of the second glove cast a new shadow over the investigation. As Inspector Meadows escorted the increasingly flustered military man to the local constabulary for further questioning, Poirot remained at the manor, his brilliant mind working through the implications of what he had learned. The pieces of the puzzle were becoming clearer, but the picture they formed was not what anyone had expected. Elizabeth Barati Ashford was indeed alive, had indeed confronted her husband about their past, but the question of who had committed murder remained tantalizingly out of reach. Poirot made his way to Miss Hartwell's room, hoping to find some clue to her hasty departure from the manor. The chamber was modest but tidy, befitting a woman of scholarly pursuits. Her botanical books were neatly arranged on a small shelf, and her writing desk bore the organized chaos of scientific research. It was in the desk drawer that Poirot found the first indication that Ellen Hartwell was not quite what she appeared to be. Beneath a layer of research notes and correspondence, he discovered a small collection of personal items that seemed oddly out of place for an unmarried research assistant. There was a child's drawing, obviously precious to its owner despite its simple execution. The drawing showed a house with a garden, and at the bottom, in a childish scrawl, were the words "Mama's flowers." Beside this was a photograph of two children, a boy and a girl, standing before what appeared to be a tea plantation.
But it was the letter hidden beneath these items that provided the most stunning revelation. Written in the same feminine hand that Poirot had seen in Professor Ashford's secret correspondence, it began, "My dearest Ellen, I know this request will seem strange, but I need you to help me at last. Your father's time of reckoning has come, and you must be there to witness his choice between honor and cowardice. 20 years I have waited for justice. 20 years your brother has grown up believing his father was dead. The time for truth has arrived." The letter was signed, E.B. Elizabeth Barati. Poirot sank into the chair at Miss Hartwell's desk, his mind reeling with the implications. Ellen Hartwell was not simply Professor Ashford's research assistant. She was his daughter, the child of his secret marriage to Elizabeth Barati. She had been working beside her father for months, perhaps years, without revealing her identity. But why? What had driven her to such an elaborate deception? The answer came in the form of a journal hidden behind the botanical texts on her shelf. Ellen's private thoughts, recorded in careful handwriting, told a story of patient planning and growing resentment. "He looks at me every day and sees nothing but a competent assistant. He has no idea that I carry his blood, that I have spent my entire life wondering why my father abandoned my mother and me. Mother has told me the story 100 times, how he cast her aside for the sake of his precious reputation, how he left us to fend for ourselves in a world that had no place for children of mixed heritage. But I have found my place beside him now, and I watch him tend his precious orchids with the same care he never showed his own family. Does he see the irony? Does he realize that the woman he trusts with his life's work is the daughter he never acknowledged?" The journal entries grew darker as they progressed, revealing a young woman torn between love and hatred for the father who had never known her. "Mother's letter has arrived. She is coming to England at last, ready to confront him with the truth. Part of me wants to see his face when he realizes what he has done, how he has rejected his own blood. But another part of me, the part that has grown to respect his dedication to science, fears what this revelation will do to him. He is not evil, merely weak, and weakness perhaps is a more tragic flaw than cruelty." Poirot closed the journal with a heavy heart. The picture that emerged was one of profound family tragedy, of secrets that had poisoned relationships across 2 generations, but he was still no closer to identifying the murderer. A sound from the garden drew his attention to the window. Dr. Whitley was walking briskly toward the greenhouse, his medical bag in hand. Curious about what might require medical attention in a building that housed only plants, Poirot made his way downstairs and followed the doctor's path. He found Dr. Whitley in the greenhouse, but not examining anything medical. Instead, the doctor was carefully removing soil samples from several of the orchid pots, placing them in small vials that he then tucked into his bag. "Dr. Whitley, may I ask what you are doing?" The doctor started violently, nearly dropping one of his vials. His face flushed red as he struggled to compose himself. "Mr. Poirot, I was just... The thing is, Theodore had asked me to examine some of his growing medium. He suspected there might be some sort of contamination affecting his plants." "And when did he make this request?" "Oh, several days ago, before this terrible business occurred." Poirot's sharp eyes noticed that Dr. Whitley's hands were shaking as he sealed the vials. "Doctor, I believe there is something you are not telling me. Perhaps you would care to explain why Professor Ashford would ask a medical doctor to analyze soil samples." Dr. Whitley's composure cracked entirely. "You don't understand, Mr. Poirot. Theodore wasn't just my patient, he was my friend. We had known each other since university. When he told me about his situation, about Elizabeth returning and threatening to expose everything, I couldn't just stand by and watch his life be destroyed." "What exactly did you do, doctor?" "I provided him with advice about how to handle the situation. Medical advice, you understand. Theodore had been under tremendous stress, and I was concerned about his heart. And these soil samples, doctor." Whitley looked around the greenhouse desperately, as if seeking an escape route among the orchids. "Theodore asked me to examine them because he suspected someone had been adding something to his plant's water supply. something that might be harmful, poison. He thought someone was trying to damage his collection. Some of his rarest specimens had begun showing signs of distress, and he couldn't identify the cause. He was particularly worried about that lady's slipper orchid, the one that appeared mysteriously in the wrong section of the greenhouse. This revelation cast the misplaced orchid in an entirely new light. If someone had deliberately placed it there, knowing it would suffer in the wrong environment, it suggested a level of botanical knowledge that significantly narrowed the field of suspects. "Doctor," Poirot said carefully, "I believe you know more about Professor Ashford's death than you have admitted. The time for half-truths has passed." Dr. Whitley slumped against the potting bench, the fight going out of him entirely. "You're right, of course. I've been a fool, trying to protect people who may not deserve protection. Tell me everything. Theodore called me 3 nights ago, in a state of extreme agitation. He said Elizabeth had visited him, here in the greenhouse. She had demanded that he publicly acknowledge their marriage and provide for their children. But there was more to it than that. More? She had discovered that Ellen Hartwell was working for him. Elizabeth had recognized her daughter from descriptions Theodore had innocently provided in their correspondence. She was furious that Theodore had been benefiting from Ellen's expertise while remaining ignorant of her true identity. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. And Professor Ashford's reaction to this revelation? He was devastated. The realization that he had been working closely with his own daughter, that she had been observing him all this time without revealing herself, it nearly broke him. He began to understand the magnitude of the pain he had caused, not just to Elizabeth but to their children. So he agreed to Elizabeth's demands. Yes, but it was too late. The damage to his family was irreparable. Ellen had overheard their conversation. She had been working late in the greenhouse, cataloguing specimens. When she heard her parents arguing about her, she finally understood the full scope of the deception that had shaped her life. The pieces were falling into place now, but the picture they formed was more tragic than Poirot had anticipated. What happened then, Doctor? Theodore was determined to make amends. He planned to announce his marriage to Elizabeth publicly, to acknowledge Ellen and her brother as his legitimate children, to provide for them financially. But someone prevented him from doing so. Dr. Whitley nodded miserably. "I found him the next morning, strangled with Elizabeth's glove. But I also found something else, a note hidden in his jacket pocket." "What did this note say?" "It was from Ellen. She wrote that she couldn't bear to watch him destroy himself trying to fix what couldn't be repaired. She said the family was better off with him dead than with the shame of his public confession." Poirot felt the familiar tingle of understanding that preceded the solution to a puzzle. "Doctor, where is this note now?" "I destroyed it. I thought I was protecting Ellen from suspicion. She was so young, and she had suffered so much already. And the second glove, Ellen gave it to me to dispose of. She was in a state of complete hysteria, convinced that her mother would be blamed for the murder. I promised to help her, but then when Colonel Thornfield claimed to have disposed of it, I realized someone else was also trying to protect Elizabeth." The tragic irony of the situation was not lost on Poirot. A family that had been torn apart by secrets had been driven to murder by the prospect of those secrets finally being revealed. Ellen Hartwell had killed her father, not from hatred, but from a misguided attempt to protect the family that had never acknowledged her existence. Chapter 6: The Mother's Sorrow. The afternoon light was fading as Poirot made his way back to the manor house, his mind heavy with the tragic revelations that had emerged from the greenhouse. The case was nearly complete now, but the solution brought no satisfaction, only a deep sadness for the lives that had been destroyed by pride, prejudice, and the weight of secrets carried too long. He found James Ashford in the drawing room, pouring himself a generous whiskey despite the early hour. The young man's hands shook as he raised the glass to his lips, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone whose world had been fundamentally altered. "Mr. Ashford," Poirot said gently, "I believe you know why I am here." James set down his glass and turned to face the detective. "Ellen told me everything before she left, about who she really is, about what she did. I suppose you've come to arrest her. Where has she gone?" "To turn herself in, I believe. She couldn't live with what she had done, especially after learning the truth about Uncle Theodore's intentions. She thought she was protecting the family from scandal, but instead Instead, she deprived her father of the chance to make amends for his past mistakes. James nodded bitterly. The irony is that I don't care about the scandal. Uncle Theodore raised me, gave me opportunities I never would have had otherwise. If acknowledging his Indian family would have brought him peace, I would have supported him completely. And what of your inheritance? The estate, the professor's fortune. Blood is more important than money, Mr. Poirot. Ellen and her brother are Theodore's legitimate children. The estate should go to them, not to me. Poirot was impressed by the young man's integrity, but his attention was drawn to the sound of a carriage approaching the manor. Through the window he could see Inspector Meadows returning with a passenger, a middle-aged woman dressed in black, her bearing dignified, despite the obvious strain she was under. Elizabeth Barati Ashford had returned. Poirot met them in the entrance hall, and found himself face to face with a woman whose beauty had been refined rather than diminished by 20 years of exile and hardship. Her dark eyes held depths of sorrow that spoke of losses that could never be fully understood by those who had not endured them. Mrs. Ashford, Poirot said, offering a slight bow. I am Hercule Poirot. I believe you know why I wished to speak with you. Inspector Meadows has told me about Ellen, she replied, her voice carefully controlled. He says she has confessed to killing Theodore. You do not seem surprised by this revelation. Elizabeth's composure wavered slightly. I am her mother, Monsieur Poirot. I know the anger that has been growing in her heart. When I decided to confront Theodore at last, I should have anticipated that Ellen might take matters into her own hands. You blame yourself for what happened. I blame myself for many things, for allowing my desire for justice to override my concern for my children's welfare, for not recognizing that Ellen's decision to work for Theodore was motivated by more than scientific interest, for not seeing that she was as wounded by his abandonment as I was. Inspector Meadows shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Ashford, I must ask you about your movements on the night of the murder. We have evidence that you visited the greenhouse that evening. Yes, I was there. Theodore had agreed to meet with me one final time, to discuss the terms of his public acknowledgement of our marriage. We argued, I admit, 20 years of injustice cannot be easily set aside, but when I left him, he was very much alive, and you took nothing with you when you departed. Elizabeth's eyes flashed with understanding. You mean my gloves? No, I left wearing both of them. I only discovered one was missing when I returned to my lodgings in the village. Then how do you explain the glove found in your husband's hand? Theodore must have pulled it from my hand during our argument. He was trying to restrain me when I became emotional. The fabric of the glove was delicate. It tore easily when he grasped it. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. And you did not return to retrieve it? No, I was too distraught to think clearly. I spent the night walking through the village, trying to decide whether I had made a terrible mistake in coming back to England. Mrs. Ashford, Poirot said gently, I believe your daughter acted out of love for you, misguided though it may have been. She overheard your argument with Professor Ashford, and feared that his public confession would bring more pain to your family. Elizabeth's careful composure finally cracked, and tears began to flow down her cheeks. Ellen always tried to protect me, even as a child. When the other children in Burma would taunt her about her heritage, she would fight them rather than let them see her cry. I should have known she would see Theodore's confession not as justice, but as another form of humiliation for our family. Where is she now? At the police station in the county town. She insisted on making a full confession, despite my attempts to dissuade her. She says she cannot live with the knowledge that she destroyed the one chance we had for reconciliation with Theodore. The tragedy of the situation was overwhelming. A family that had been separated by prejudice and pride had finally found each other, only to be torn apart again by violence born of misunderstanding and pain. Mrs. Ashford, Poirot said carefully, there is something else you should know. Professor Ashford had already taken steps to acknowledge you and your children. He had drafted a new will, naming Ellen and her brother as his primary heirs. He had written letters to his colleagues, preparing them for his announcement. He was not acting out of fear or coercion. He was acting out of genuine remorse and love. Elizabeth's sobs intensified. If only Ellen had known. If only she had waited just one more day. The tragedy of this case, Poirot reflected, is that everyone involved was acting out of love.
Ellen's love for her mother, Colonel Thornfield's love for his friend, Dr. Whitley's desire to protect the innocent, James's loyalty to his uncle. Yet, love without communication, love without trust, can be as destructive as hatred. As they stood in the growing darkness of the manor hall, surrounded by the ghosts of what might have been, Poirot reflected on the peculiar nature of this case. Unlike many of his investigations, where the revelation of the murderer brought a sense of justice and closure, this solution brought only sadness and regret. The glove in the greenhouse had indeed led him to the truth, but it was a truth that no one, least of all the participants, had wanted to discover. Chapter 7: The Weight of Truth. The village police station was a modest brick building that had served Little Ashford's law enforcement needs for over a century. As Poirot and Inspector Meadows approached its narrow entrance, the detective reflected on the irony that such a small, unremarkable place would be the setting for the final act of this tragic drama. Ellen Hartwell sat in the station's single interview room, her hands folded in her lap with the same composed precision she had shown while working among her father's orchids. But her red-rimmed eyes and the tremor in her voice betrayed the emotional turmoil that raged beneath her calm exterior. "Miss Hartwell," Poirot said as he took the seat across from her, "or perhaps I should say Miss Ashford." "Ellen Barati," she corrected quietly. "I have never used my father's name. I earned my position through my own merit, not through any claim to his recognition. Yet you chose to work for him. That could not have been coincidence." Ellen's composure wavered slightly. "I told myself it was purely professional. Professor Ashford was one of the world's leading orchid specialists, and I needed the experience to advance my own research. But you're right, of course. I was drawn to him by something more than scientific curiosity. You wanted to know the man who had abandoned you. I wanted to understand how he could have forgotten us so completely. When I first wrote to him seeking the position, I half expected him to recognize my mother's surname. When he didn't, I realized that we had truly meant nothing to him." Poirot studied her face carefully. "And yet, as you worked beside him, did your feelings toward him change?" For the first time since entering the room, Ellen's mask of composure cracked completely. "That was the worst part," she whispered. "I discovered that I respected him. He was brilliant, dedicated, genuinely passionate about his work. He treated me as an equal, valued my contributions, encouraged my research. For the first time in my life, I experienced what it might have been like to have a father who cared about my achievements. But this only made his earlier abandonment more painful. Precisely, I could see what kind of man he was capable of being, which made his rejection of my mother and me all the more devastating. He had chosen his reputation over his family, his career over his children." Inspector Meadows leaned forward. "Miss Barati, would you please tell us exactly what happened on the night Professor Ashford died?" Ellen drew a shaky breath before beginning her account. "I was working late in the greenhouse, cataloguing a new shipment of specimens from Thailand. I heard voices, my father and another woman. I recognized my mother's voice immediately. You knew she had come to England. She had written to me, asking me to help her gain access to my father. I refused. I told her I wanted nothing to do with any confrontation, but she came anyway." "What did you hear of their conversation?" "Everything. They spoke of their marriage, of the choice he had made to abandon her, of his offer to finally acknowledge us publicly. But I also heard my mother's pain, the 20 years of exile and poverty she had endured because of his cowardice." Ellen's voice grew stronger as she continued, as if the telling of her story was providing its own form of relief. "When my mother left, I remained hidden among the plants. My father sat alone for nearly an hour, just staring at the orchids. Finally he called my name. He knew you were there. He had always known, I think. He said he had suspected my true identity from the moment I first wrote to him, but he had been too much of a coward to confront the truth. He apologized for abandoning my mother, for denying me his name, for all the years we had lost." "And your response?" Ellen's hands clenched into fists in her lap. "I told him that his apologies were 20 years too late, that his public confession would only bring more shame to our family, that we were better off without him. But he persisted in his intention to acknowledge you. Yes, he said he had already drafted a new will, that he planned to transfer the estate to my brother and me. He said he wanted to give us the recognition and security he should have provided years ago." Poirot's voice was gentle when he asked, What happened then, Miss Barati? I lost control. All the anger I had been suppressing for months, all the resentment at working beside the man who had destroyed my family, all the frustration at seeing him receive respect and admiration while my mother lived in exile, it all came pouring out. You attacked him. My mother had left one of her gloves behind during their argument. I picked it up, intending to return it to her. But when I approached my father, he was still talking about his plans to make amends, about how he hoped we could build a relationship. The hypocrisy of it, 20 years too late, and only because my mother had forced his hand, was more than I could bear. Ellen paused, struggling to find words for what came next. I don't remember the exact moment I began strangling him. It was as if someone else had taken control of my body. By the time I realized what I was doing, it was too late. And afterward, I panicked. I tried to remove the glove from his hands, but his grip had tightened in death. I managed to pull away the second glove, then fled to my room. I spent the rest of the night trying to decide what to do. Inspector Meadows made notes throughout her confession, but Poirot's attention was focused entirely on Ellen's face. What he saw there was not the cold calculation of a premeditated murderer, but the anguish of a woman who had been driven to an act of violence by circumstances beyond her emotional capacity to handle. Miss Barati, he said finally, why did you place the lady's slipper orchid in the wrong section of the greenhouse? Ellen looked confused. I didn't. I would never have made such an elementary error in plant placement. This revelation gave Poirot pause. If Ellen hadn't moved the orchid, then who had? And why? Think carefully, he pressed. When you discovered the orchid in the wrong location, did you move it to its proper place? No, I left it where it was. I assumed my father had placed it there temporarily for some reason related to his research. It wasn't my place to question his methods, but you must have known it would suffer in those conditions. Of course, but I also knew that my father was meticulous about his plants. I assumed he would move it before any permanent damage occurred. As Ellen continued her confession, providing details about her disposal of the second glove, and her desperate attempts to protect her mother from suspicion, Poirot found himself troubled by the mystery of the misplaced orchid. Every detail of the crime scene had meaning, and this particular anomaly suggested that there were aspects of the case that remained unexplored. But as he looked at the broken woman across from him, confessing to a crime born of 20 years of accumulated pain and resentment, he realized that the technical details of the murder were less important than the human tragedy that had precipitated it. Ellen Barati had killed her father, but she had also been one of his victims, a daughter denied the love and recognition that should have been her birthright, driven to violence by the very injustices she had sought to escape. Chapter 8. The Garden of Deception. As Ellen Barati's confession concluded, and Inspector Meadows began the formal procedures of charging her with murder, Poirot found himself unexpectedly troubled by the loose ends that remained in the case. Experience had taught him that when details didn't align perfectly, there were usually important truths yet to be uncovered. The mystery of the displaced lady's slipper orchid continued to nag at his methodical mind. If Ellen hadn't moved it, and Professor Ashford would never have made such an elementary error, then who had placed it in the wrong environment? More importantly, why? Returning to the manor, as evening shadows lengthened across the grounds, Poirot made his way once again to the greenhouse. The building seemed different now, less like a sanctuary, and more like a mausoleum, filled with beautiful specimens that would soon need new caretakers.
He found James Ashford there, moving slowly among the orchids with a watering can, his movements careful but inexpert. The young man looked up as Poirot entered, his face showing the strain of the past few days. I'm trying to keep them alive until we can find someone qualified to take over, James explained. Uncle Theodore would have hated to see his life's work destroyed because of what happened here. A noble sentiment, Poirot observed, watching as James approached the misplaced Cypripedium calceolus. Tell me, Mr. Ashford, what do you know about orchid cultivation? Very little, I'm afraid. Uncle Theodore tried to teach me when I was younger, but I never had the patience for it. Ellen was far more skilled than I could ever hope to be. Yet you seem to know which plants require water. James paused in his work. Dr. Whitley has been advising me. He may not be a botanist, but he understands the basics of plant care. He's been quite helpful, actually. This mention of Dr. Whitley sparked a new line of thought in Poirot's mind. The doctor had been present at the manor frequently in recent days, ostensibly to provide medical support during the crisis. But his knowledge of botany, his access to the greenhouse, and his obvious emotional investment in protecting the Ashford family made him a figure worthy of closer examination. "Mr. Ashford, has Dr. Whitley been visiting the greenhouse regularly?" "Oh yes, almost daily since Uncle Theodore's death. He says he feels responsible for helping maintain the collection. He was quite close to my uncle. You know, they'd been friends since university, and he has been alone in the greenhouse on these visits. Sometimes, I don't monitor his movements. He's practically family." Poirot excused himself and made his way to the village surgery where Dr. Whitley maintained his practice. He found the doctor in his consulting room, bent over a ledger book with the intense concentration of someone trying to lose himself in routine tasks. "Dr. Whitley, I wonder if I might ask you a few more questions about Professor Ashford's death." The doctor looked up with obvious reluctance. "I thought the case was closed, Mr. Poirot. Ellen has confessed, hasn't she?" "Indeed she has, but there remain certain details that require clarification. For instance, the matter of the lady's slipper orchid that was found in the wrong section of the greenhouse." Dr. Whitley's face went pale. "I'm not sure I understand what you're asking. The plant in question requires very specific growing conditions, conditions that would have been well known to Professor Ashford and to Miss Poirot. Yet someone placed it in an environment where it would inevitably suffer, someone with enough botanical knowledge to understand the consequences of their action. Perhaps the professor was conducting some sort of experiment, or perhaps, Poirot said quietly, someone wanted to create a clear sign that the greenhouse had been disturbed, that an intruder unfamiliar with proper orchid care had been present." The silence that followed this observation stretched uncomfortably long. Dr. Whitley's hands trembled slightly as he closed his ledger book. "Doctor, I believe it is time for complete honesty. You have been trying to protect someone throughout this investigation, but your efforts may have inadvertently made the situation worse." Dr. Whitley's shoulders sagged in defeat. "You're right, of course. I should have spoken up from the beginning, but I was so afraid of making things worse for Elizabeth." "Elizabeth Ashford, what did you do to protect her?" "I was the one who moved the orchid. After I found Theodore's body, before Mrs. Pemberton discovered it officially, I realized that Elizabeth might be suspected of the murder. I knew about their meeting the previous evening, knew how volatile their relationship had become. So you attempted to make it appear that someone unfamiliar with the greenhouse had committed the crime. It was foolish, I realize now, but I thought if I could create evidence of an outside intruder, the investigation would focus away from Elizabeth and her family." Poirot shook his head sadly. "Dr. Whitley, your well-intentioned deception nearly led to an innocent woman being charged with murder. If not for Ellen's confession, your false evidence might have convinced the authorities that Elizabeth was guilty." I know. The irony is unbearable. I was trying to protect her, but I made her appear more guilty instead. There is something else, is there not? Something you have not yet revealed about that morning when you found the body." Dr. Whitley buried his face in his hands. "You're very perceptive, Mr. Poirot. Yes, there was something else. When I found Theodore, he was still barely alive. He managed to speak a few words before he died." "What did he say?" "He said forgive her. I assumed he was referring to Elizabeth, asking me to ensure she wasn't blamed for his death. That's why I was so determined to protect her. But now you realize he may have been referring to Ellen." "Yes. If he knew his daughter had killed him, his last thought would have been to protect her from the consequences of her action. He was finally acting like a father, even in death." This revelation cast the entire tragedy in an even more poignant light. Professor Ashford had used his final breath not to identify his killer, but to ask for mercy for the daughter he had failed in life. "Dr. Whitley, your intentions were honorable, but your deception has complicated matters considerably. I trust you will make a full confession to Inspector Meadows about your interference with the crime scene." "Of course, I should have done so immediately." As Poirot left the surgery, he reflected on the complex web of loyalties and deceptions that had surrounded this case. Everyone involved, Ellen, Elizabeth, Colonel Thornfield, Dr. Whitley, Even James Ashford had been motivated by love and loyalty, yet their attempts to protect each other had only deepened the tragedy. The case was solved, but the solution brought no satisfaction. Like the orchids in Professor Ashford's greenhouse, some wounds were too deep to heal, some separations too long to bridge. Chapter 9: The Final Bloom. 2 weeks had passed since Ellen Barati's arrest, and Poirot found himself once again walking through the gardens of Ashford Manor. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and the last roses of the season clung desperately to their bushes, their petals beginning to fade and fall. The estate had taken on an air of melancholy transition. James Ashford was preparing to turn the property over to Ellen's younger brother, who had travelled from Burma to claim his unexpected inheritance. It was a gesture that spoke to James's fundamental decency, but it also meant the end of the Ashford family's long association with the manor. Elizabeth Barati Ashford had remained in England to be near her daughter during the legal proceedings. The woman who had once been cast out of English society for her mixed heritage now found herself the rightful mistress of one of the county's finest estates, a bitter irony that brought her no joy. Poirot found her in the greenhouse, tending to the orchids with the careful attention of someone who understood their delicate needs. She looked up as he entered, her face showing the strain of recent weeks but also a dignity that had survived 20 years of exile and hardship. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, setting down her watering can, "I understand you're returning to London today." "Indeed, madame. The case here is concluded, though not in a manner that brings satisfaction to anyone involved. Ellen's trial will begin next month. Her solicitor believes that given the circumstances, the emotional strain she was under, the provocation of years of abandonment, she may receive a sentence of manslaughter rather than murder. That would be a just outcome. Your daughter was driven to violence by circumstances that no young woman should have to endure." Elizabeth nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "I blame myself, Monsieur Poirot. If I hadn't returned to England, if I hadn't forced this confrontation with Theodore, none of this would have happened. Madame, the fault lies not with you but with a society that forced impossible choices upon young people 20 years ago. Your husband was placed in an untenable position, torn between love and duty, between personal happiness and social expectations. His decision to abandon you was wrong, but it was also understandable given the pressures he faced. And Ellen, was her decision also understandable?" Poirot considered this carefully before responding. "Your daughter carried the burden of her father's rejection her entire life. When she finally had the opportunity to confront him about his abandonment, the weight of 20 years of pain became too much to bear. It was a moment of madness born from a lifetime of justified anger." They walked together through the rows of orchids, past the spot where Professor Ashford had died. Elizabeth had removed all traces of the crime scene, but the space still seemed to hold an echo of the tragedy that had occurred there. "What will become of the collection?" Poirot asked. "Ellen's brother has no interest in botany, and I lack Theodore's expertise. We've arranged to donate the rarest specimens to the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew. The more common varieties will be distributed among local enthusiasts. It seems fitting that Theodore's life's work should continue to flourish, even if the man himself cannot. And you, madame, what are your plans?" "I'll remain in England until Ellen's case is resolved. After that," she shrugged. "Burma was my home for 20 years, but England is my birthplace. Perhaps it's time to reclaim my place in both worlds." They reached the section of the greenhouse where the lady's slipper orchid had been misplaced. Dr. Whitley's misguided attempt to misdirect the investigation. Elizabeth had moved the plant to its proper location, where it was slowly recovering from its ordeal. "It's remarkable how resilient these flowers can be," she observed. "They can survive transplantation, changes in environment, even periods of neglect. But they need the right conditions to truly flourish." "As do people," Poirot replied. "Your family was transplanted too young, forced to adapt to conditions that were hostile to your growth. It is hardly surprising that some damage occurred. Theodore understood that, in the end. James showed me the letters he had written to his colleagues, preparing them for his announcement about our marriage. He was ready to face the scandal, ready to accept responsibility for his past actions. If only Ellen had known. If only I had trusted him enough to wait. But 20 years of silence had taught me to expect the worst from people's capacity for change. As they prepared to leave the greenhouse, Elizabeth paused beside one final plant, a white Cattleya orchid that had been among Professor Ashford's most prized specimens. Its blooms were pure and perfect, untouched by the tragedy that had surrounded it. Theodore always said that orchids were like people, she said softly, each one unique, each one requiring different care to reach its full potential. He was better at understanding flowers than he was at understanding human hearts. Perhaps that was his tragedy, Poirot suggested. He could nurture delicate blooms to perfection, but he could not find the courage to nurture the love that might have sustained his family. They walked together toward the manor house, leaving the greenhouse and its silent witnesses behind. At the front door, Elizabeth offered Poirot her hand in farewell. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot, for treating our family tragedy with such sensitivity. I know you could have approached this case with cold logic alone, but you showed compassion for the human pain beneath the crime. Madame, justice without mercy is as barren as a garden without flowers. Your family has suffered enough. What matters now is finding a way for the surviving members to heal and grow." As Poirot's taxi carried him away from Ashford Manor, he reflected on the complex nature of the case he was leaving behind. The mystery of the glove in the greenhouse had been solved, but the deeper questions it raised about family, loyalty, and the long-term consequences of moral cowardice would linger long after the legal proceedings were concluded. In his experience, some crimes were puzzles to be solved through logic and deduction. Others were tragedies to be understood through empathy and wisdom. The death of Professor Theodore Ashford belonged firmly in the latter category, a crime born not from greed or malice, but from the accumulated weight of love denied and recognition withheld. The orchids in the greenhouse would continue to bloom, tended by new hands and nurtured with fresh hope. Perhaps in time, the Poirot family would also find a way to bloom again, transplanted at last to soil that could sustain their growth. Chapter 10: Seeds of Redemption. Spring had returned to Little Ashford when Poirot next visited the village, drawn by a letter from James Ashford requesting his presence at a rather unusual ceremony. The young man had written that the new owners of the manor wished to dedicate a memorial garden to Professor Ashford, and they hoped the detective who had solved the case would attend. The transformation of the estate was remarkable. Under the guidance of Elizabeth Ashford and her son, who had proven to have more interest in horticulture than anyone had initially suspected, the grounds had been redesigned to incorporate plants from both England and Burma, creating a unique fusion of botanical traditions. Ellen had been sentenced to 5 years in prison for manslaughter, a result that reflected both the tragic circumstances of her crime and the mercy of a judge who understood that justice sometimes required compassion. She was expected to be released on parole within 3 years, and her family was already making plans for her return. "The memorial garden is Ellen's design," Elizabeth explained as she led Poirot through the new plantings. She created it during the trial, as a way of working through her grief and guilt. Her brother has had it installed exactly according to her specifications. The garden was a masterpiece of symbolic design. English roses grew alongside Burmese jasmine, creating a harmony that had eluded the human members of the Ashford family for so many years. At the center of the garden stood a small greenhouse, much simpler than the elaborate structure where the murder had occurred, but filled with orchids that represented every continent and climate. "We've established a foundation," Elizabeth continued, "to provide scholarships for young botanists from mixed heritage backgrounds. Theodore's scientific papers are being published in a special collection, with all proceeds going to support the foundation's work." "A fitting memorial," Poirot observed. "Professor Ashford's legacy will live on in ways that honor both his scientific achievements and his personal growth." They were joined by Dr. Whitley, who had been instrumental in establishing the foundation. The doctor had never fully recovered from his guilt over the misguided attempts to protect Elizabeth, but he had channeled that regret into constructive action. "Ellen writes regularly," he reported. "She's been working in the prison garden teaching other inmates about plant cultivation. It seems she's found a way to turn her knowledge into healing, both for herself and for others." Colonel Thornfield approached, leaning heavily on a walking stick, but maintaining his military bearing. "Remarkable, young woman, that Ellen takes after her father in her dedication to botany, but she has her mother's strength of character." "You've visited her in prison?" Poirot asked. "Regularly. Felt it was my duty given my role in the original deception that led to this tragedy." She's forgiven me more readily than I've been able to forgive myself. The dedication ceremony was simple but moving. Elizabeth spoke about her husband's love for both plants and learning, about the importance of creating beauty in the world despite the mistakes of the past. Her son, a quiet young man who shared his father's careful attention to detail, read a passage from one of Professor Ashford's scientific papers about the resilience of orchids in challenging environments. But it was James Ashford's speech that moved Poirot most deeply. The young man spoke about the family he had discovered he never really knew, about the courage required to acknowledge past wrongs, and about the hope that future generations would learn from the mistakes of their predecessors. "My uncle was not a perfect man," James said, his voice carrying across the garden where family, friends and villagers had gathered. "He made choices that caused great pain to people he should have protected and cherished. But in his final days he was trying to make amends. This garden represents not just his memory, but his hope for redemption, the belief that love and understanding can eventually overcome prejudice and fear." As the ceremony concluded and the guests began to disperse, Poirot found himself alone with Elizabeth in the memorial greenhouse. She was adjusting the position of a particularly delicate orchid, her movements showing the expertise she had developed over the months since taking over her husband's collection. "Do you ever regret coming back to England?" Poirot asked. Elizabeth considered the question carefully before responding. "I regret the pain it caused Ellen, and I regret that Theodore and I never had the chance to find peace with each other while he was alive. But I don't regret seeking the truth at last. Our children deserve to know their heritage, and Theodore deserved the opportunity to finally act with honor. And Ellen, how does she view what happened? She's learning to forgive herself most of all. The letters she writes speak of understanding that her father was as much a victim of the prejudices of his time as we were. She realizes now that killing him didn't solve anything, only added another layer of tragedy to an already complex situation." They stood together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the orchids that had been both witness to murder and symbol of renewal. The flowers bloomed in their perfect environment, each variety in its proper place, tended with knowledge and care. "Monsieur Poirot," Elizabeth said finally, "I've often wondered, when you first arrived here and began investigating Theodore's death, did you suspect the truth about our family from the beginning?" Poirot smiled slightly. "I suspected there were secrets, certainly. But the full truth was more complex than I initially imagined. I thought I was investigating a simple case of murder motivated by greed or revenge. Instead, I discovered a tragedy rooted in love denied and recognition withheld, and the clue that led you to Ellen. Ironically, it was her very competence that first made me suspect her true identity. She knew too much about orchids, cared too deeply about the collection, moved through the greenhouse with the familiarity of someone who belonged there. Combined with the unusual soil samples and the timing of your visit to England, the evidence pointed to a family connection. But you suspected me as well, didn't you? For a time, yes. Your mysterious return, your confrontation with Professor Ashford, the glove found in his hand, all suggested you might have killed him in a moment of rage. It was only when I understood the depth of your desire for acknowledgement rather than revenge that I began to look elsewhere for the murderer." Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. "Ellen told me once that she initially suspected me as well. When she heard our argument that night, she thought I might have killed Theodore in anger. Part of her motive for confessing was to protect me from suspicion. A family trait, it seems, the willingness to sacrifice oneself to protect others. Colonel Thornfield attempted to shield you, Doctor. Whitley tried to misdirect the investigation. Ellen confessed to spare you from blame. Even Professor Ashford, in his final moments, asked for forgiveness on behalf of his killer. Perhaps that's the real tragedy," Elizabeth mused. "We were all so busy trying to protect each other that we never learned to communicate honestly about our fears and hopes." As the afternoon sun slanted through the greenhouse glass, casting intricate patterns of light and shadow across the orchid blooms, Poirot reflected on the nature of the case that had brought him to this place. Like the flowers surrounding them, the truth had required careful cultivation, patient attention, and the right conditions to finally bloom. "The glove in the greenhouse," he said aloud, almost to himself. "What about it? It was both the key to solving the case and a symbol of everything that went wrong. Your glove torn away during an argument with the husband who had denied you for 20 years, then used as the instrument of his death by the daughter he had never acknowledged.
3 generations of pain concentrated in one small piece of leather. But also 3 generations of love, Elizabeth added. Theodore grasped it when he was trying to calm me during our argument, a gesture of connection however brief. Ellen used it in a moment of anguish over the father she had longed to know, and even in death Theodore held on to it, perhaps as his final attempt to bridge the gap between his past and present. They made their way slowly back toward the manor house, where the dedication reception was continuing on the terrace. The sound of conversation and laughter drifted across the gardens, a hopeful counterpoint to the tragic events that had brought this new family together. "Will you stay in England permanently now?" Poirot asked as they approached the house. "I think so. Burma will always be part of my heart, but this is where my children's future lies. Ellen will need support when she's released, and my son has found his calling in botanical research. Besides," she smiled sadly, "Theodore and I never had our chance to build a life together. Perhaps overseeing his legacy is the closest we'll ever come to the partnership we might have had." As his taxi prepared to carry him back to the station, Poirot took one final look at Ashford Manor and its transformed gardens. The building itself remained unchanged, but the spirit of the place had been fundamentally altered. Where once there had been secrets and denial, there was now openness and acceptance. Where once there had been isolation and prejudice, there was now connection and understanding. The case of the glove in the greenhouse had taught him that some mysteries couldn't be solved simply by identifying the killer. The deeper puzzle, how families could be torn apart by circumstances beyond their control, how love could be distorted into violence, how redemption might eventually emerge from tragedy, required a different kind of detection altogether. As the train carried him back toward London, Poirot reflected on the strange satisfaction he felt despite the tragic nature of the case. Ellen Berati would serve her sentence and eventually return to build a new life with the family that had finally acknowledged her. The Ashford legacy would continue through the foundation and the memorial garden, ensuring that Professor Theodore's work in botany would be remembered alongside his ultimate attempts at moral courage. Most importantly, the truth had finally bloomed. Like the hardy orchids in the greenhouse, it had required patience, proper conditions and careful tending. But once it emerged, it had proven strong enough to survive transplantation from the shadows of the past into the light of understanding. The mystery was solved, but more than that, the family was healing, and in Poirot's experience, that was the rarest and most valuable resolution of all. As the countryside rolled past his window, Poirot allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. Every plant had its season, every secret its time for revelation. In the greenhouse of human relationships, even the most delicate blooms could eventually find the strength to flourish, given enough love, patience and care. The glove in the greenhouse had revealed not just a murderer, but a family's capacity for forgiveness and growth, and that perhaps was the most important mystery of all to solve. And so concludes our journey with the remarkable Hercule Poirot through the glove in the greenhouse. Thank you for joining me, Stephen, here at Cozy Mysteries, as we witnessed how love denied can bloom into tragedy, but also how truth, like the most resilient orchid, can eventually find its way to the light. Until our next mystery together, remember that in the garden of human nature, every season brings both endings and new beginnings.